Wix Studio, one end-to-end web creation platform for your agency to deliver exceptional work with absolute efficiency.
The #1 long-form writer that helps SEOs outrank competition at the click of a button using real-time research and NLP. Start ranking content today with contentatscale.ai.
Thank you. I've actually decided not sleeping before a talk is now my new thing because it makes me not nervous. So if anyone needs advice out there, I'd highly recommend it. So hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. My name is Emma. Thank you for that lovely introduction. As was said, I am a service designer. So that's basically like UX design, but not just the digital bit, like the whole journey that people go through to do a thing. I work for myself. I started a company called Design for Joy about 2 years ago after working at NHS Digital for 18 months during a pandemic and having very little joy. And I'm here today to tell a story about some work I did when I was there. So before I tell you that story, I need to set some context. So hopefully this is not new news to anybody in the room, but sex and gender are not the same thing. So sex talks to a person's biological characteristics. It's something that's assigned to you at birth. Gender is a social construct. It talks to our attitudes, our behaviours. People might not identify as a binary gender. People might identify along a spectrum. Their gender might change over time. And importantly, the gender people identify with might not match the sex they were assigned at birth. So some other context that I have to set, but I don't like to set, is that sadly we're living in a world where not everybody is treated equally. And that can apply to many aspects of life. But I'm particularly, I want to highlight some of the ways in which trans people are really struggling at the moment. And to be frank, it's only getting worse. So I'm sure these statistics that were taken from the Trans Life Survey in 2021 are probably out of date now, and things have probably got worse. So 27% of trans people have experienced homelessness. That's nearly 1 in 4 trans people have lived on the streets. 57% of trans people avoid going to the doctor when they are unwell. That's over half of trans people avoid going to the doctor. And that can be for many reasons. They might feel like the medical professionals that they have access to don't have a good enough understanding of their specific health needs. They might face discrimination. And the reason why I talk about this is that this population is increasing. So these figures were taken from the latest census, which tells us that around 260,000 people say that their gender identity doesn't match the sex they were assigned at birth. So that's about 0.5% of the population. And the reason why I want to put these numbers on the screen is that when you're working in my industry in kind of large organisations, government departments, healthcare organisations, large banks, you name it, people like to throw around small percentages, and I'm sure this happens where you work as well, as a kind of excuse to ignore people, you know? It's like, oh, that's only 0.5 of the population. We don't have to worry about them, you know? It's only a small number. They're an edge case, you know? But that 0.5% is actually a huge amount of people. And even if it wasn't, even if it was a small amount of people, even if it was 2 people, all of these people deserve to be respected in the same way that everybody else does. They're all human beings. They all have families, feelings, and lives. And that's particularly important because my dad is trans. So this is us. On my dad's 60th birthday, we went to the ballet at the Royal Albert Hall, Swan Lake. It's very good. Highly recommend it. So that's my context. I'm going to move on to tell you the story of what we did. So as I said, this was some work I did when I worked at NHS Digital. I was their lead service designer, or one of their lead service designers, in the NHS website team at the time. And I got airlifted onto crisis response projects, as you can imagine, with the world kind of dealing with what it was dealing with. And I worked on the first release of the national booking service for COVID-19 vaccinations. There were other booking services, not confusing at all. So this is not the whole story of that. There was obviously a lot of work that went into it, but it tells the story of about an 8-day period of time where we faced a problem. So before I tell you more about that problem, I need to introduce you to another NHS Digital service called the Personal Demographic Service, affectionately known as PDS. So you might have come across this service on your travels. It is a platinum service at NHS Digital, which basically means it's very important, very expensive, very old, very clunky, and it's a big database, basically, that holds all our demographic details and our NHS numbers. And the reason why this is important to the story is that when we were designing the booking service, we had to design in a way to verify that people were who they said they were before they booked a vaccine. And there were two ways we could do that. We could either connect to NHS login, which some of you will be familiar with if you've got the NHS app. That's how you access that app, basically. But you need ID to be able to use that. And we were designing a national scale service that potentially everybody in the country would have to use. We wanted to put as few roadblocks in people's way as possible. So connecting to PDS was a kind of lower barrier to entry way to verify people's identities. And there were two ways you could do it. If you know your NHS number, you pop that in, I think with your date of birth as well, and it finds you. But we know a lot of people don't know their NHS number. So if you didn't, you could type in a series of demographic details, and it would find you on this system. So up until this point, and this was weeks before, a small number of weeks before we were due to go live, we were operating under the assumption that we would have to ask people for their first name, their last name, their date of birth, and their postcode. But turns out, at the final hour, someone said, actually, you're going to have to ask for people's gender as well. And I said, well, that's a bit weird. Why would we have to do that? To book someone an appointment. It doesn't really matter what gender you are. All you're doing here is booking an appointment. It's also unlikely to improve match rates because there's only so many genders you can be. And I'll show you in a minute what options you're given in the NHS. So my kind of ears pricked up a little bit, and I was curious as to why this was a thing. So it turns out that the API that allows services to talk to other services, and in this case it was the booking service wanting to talk to PDS, that was developed in such a way that gender was a mandatory field when doing that match. So what we're doing there is looking you up on this database, basically. So when we're doing that lookup, gender is built in. Someone in their infinite wisdom decided to code that in. Great work. So I explored this problem a little bit more deeply, and turns out the data is fairly uninclusive as well. So the data held on the system is labelled gender, but it's actually sex data, so that's where that conflation kind of comes in. And these are the options you're given. So God help anyone that is coded as unknown. But yeah, this is what you're allowed to be, apparently. So obviously, you know, what we were working with was fairly uninclusive. It was going to be quite hard for us to work around this problem. Before I go any further, I do like to add a little disclaimer at this point to say that we weren't storing the data. We weren't keeping it at all. We were just capturing it, doing this lookup. We weren't using it for clinical reasons. We weren't using it for monitoring reasons. We wouldn't use it at all because we weren't storing it. The reason why I say that is because when I spoke about this innocently on a Friday afternoon on Twitter once, I broke the internet because people thought I was erasing their sex data from their NHS records. I do not have that power. So I was keen that we didn't jump straight to designing a screen and accepting defeat on this. So I wanted to explore if there's a way we could do this under the hood without putting a screen that says, what is your gender in the booking service? So I worked really closely with a technical architect. We asked around. I was like, this is surely not the first time this has happened. And we looked at what technical solutions we could possibly implement. So we looked at whether we could just do 4 calls. So call all those options, like, doesn't matter, we'll find you. But there was a worry. I mean, this was the most important thing NHS Digital were working on at that point, as you can imagine. And there was a fear that if we did that, we would put too much load on the system. So every time you do a call, that puts load on the system. And there was a real worry that it would fall over, basically. The testing services had in dramatic fashion. And I don't know if any of you have ever worked in the NHS or government, but you live in fear of a Daily Mail headline. So this is what we were working with. So that wasn't allowed. We weren't allowed to do that. So we looked at doing something called cascading API calls, which basically means just we call it until we find you. So if we find you on the second call, we stop. But the data quality was so poor in clunky old PDS that we weren't allowed to do that either. So I accepted defeat and said, okay, we'll design this question, but we'll do it in the most inclusive way possible. So we worked across disciplines, brilliant content community in, I should say RIP to NHS Digital actually doesn't exist anymore. They've all merged into one. But at the time, there was a wonderful content community at NHSD and a great LGBT health team in NHS England. And we worked together to create what we thought was the most inclusive way to ask this question. And this is what we came up with. So I'm not sure if everyone right at the back can read that small text. So I will read it out for you. We purposefully didn't want to use the terms sex or gender for the reasons that I've already explained. So the question reads, which of the following best describes you? The descriptor text says, we are asking for this information to match your vaccination record to your GP record. And we offer 5 options. So female, male, non-binary, prefer not to say, and how I self-describe does not match my GP record. Continue. So I'll explain how this works, because obviously the options we're offering people don't match the data that is held in the system, for any eagle-eyed people out there that have made that connection. So if you select male or female, it just does that one call and it finds you. All good. If you select one of the other options, so the non-binary, prefer not to say, or how I self-describe options, it will do those 4 calls that I spoke about. So it doesn't really matter what's on the screen and what the data is. It will just call everything in there. And we were allowed to do that because of the working hypothesis that only a small proportion of people would be selecting one of those options based on the statistics I shared before. And the fear of services falling over went away. So we were okay to do that. So we took this question into testing, and I learned so much from this project, but I think one of the biggest things I took from this is if we can do user research in a national crisis with a last-minute problem, with about 8 days to solve it, anybody can do user research on anything that they are doing. So we got 5 people from the trans and non-binary communities to test with us. We didn't just put the question in front of them and say, what do you think? We walked them through the entire service and looked at how they interacted with it. And if you want to talk to me about user research, always happy to talk about that as well. And this is some of the things we heard from people. So if anything, it made me feel like the things that are going on are being done by people who know what they're doing, which was a heartwarming quote and lovely feedback for us. But it was also quite eye-opening. It made me realise how low the bar is here. Like, people almost expect it to be bad. Like, when they see something that's good, they're like, oh, okay, right. People are thinking about this. Which was, yeah, like I said, quite eye-opening. A scenario that we really wanted to make sure we designed for was if people were going through transition. So we knew these people would be likely having high degrees of contact with the healthcare system. They would be really clear on what was held on their records, and it might not match how they identified. And we didn't want people to have to click a button on a system that might kind of trigger dysphoria, gender dysphoria. So we wanted to design for this, and that's where that 5th option came from. And we tested that with someone in that situation, and it tested pretty well. So they said I would click female in 2018. I started my transition. Pretty much all my documents say I'm female, but my medical records still state I'm male. If I was to click female, I might not match up. So instead, they could click that 5th button. So that's pretty much what we launched with. I think we tweaked a few minor things in the content off the back of the testing. But that question went live in the first release. That was January of whatever year of the pandemic that this happened. And we started getting feedback. So we had all the usual kind of mechanisms in place to measure the service, but we started getting anecdotal feedback as well. And there was some good feedback we got. We got feedback from people emailing the LGBT team to say, I wouldn't have been able to book this vaccine if you hadn't done this work, which was great, but we also had some quite worrying feedback coming through. One of the things I didn't mention before is that this service was also used in the call centre. So if you'll remember, the rollout of the vaccines was age-based. So older people got theirs first, and there were a few of those that didn't want to book on the internet and would phone up and book over the phone. And the call centre staff had access to a very similar system, slightly different version, but pretty similar. And because of how we'd kind of designed the question and worded it, it felt a little bit like out of the ordinary, I guess, for call centre staff. We didn't sadly have the time to kind of design specifically for that situation because, you know, we were running around on fire most of the time. And we were getting feedback that call centre staff were making assumptions based on the sound of people's voices, which is fairly horrifying feedback. And if I didn't have bigger fish to fry, I would have been down there trying to sort that out. But I did, and I wanted to make the case to remove it. I wasn't happy that we'd launched the service with this in the first place. I didn't think it needed to be there. Even though we'd done a good job to make it inclusive, it was still fundamentally unnecessary. We didn't need to ask people that question for them to book a vaccination. So I took a 3-step approach to this. Bear in mind, by this point, I'd been kind of parachuted out of the team because it was pretty stressful and I needed to work on some normal stuff for a while. So the first thing I realised was this, despite the fact that I wasn't in that team anymore, I'd already built a fair bit of momentum and awareness around this issue. I was already known as the kind of annoying blonde girl in the corner that kept like harping on about this thing. And I wanted to make sure that I capitalised on that. This was a really important thing that NHS were doing at the time, like I said, and I didn't want to kind of miss my moment. So there was some emailing of CTOs at 9 o'clock at night, sending them Stonewall reports. That was fun. And then there were 2 teams that I needed to work with to make this happen. So the first team was the PDS team. I had no idea who these people were or where they lived. It turned out they were in a totally different directorate to me, which was known as the kind of scary directorate, which I think had about 1 designer of thousands of people in there. So I found them and we had chats, and there was, you know, they were receptive to the idea, but I kind of got the feeling that they might be keen to, you know, kick this into the long grass and not prioritise it. So I knew they'd got a new director in post, so I escalated it to him because I thought he might want to do something good in his, you know, first few weeks of being in post. And he did, and he told them to do it, and then they all hated me. But it worked. And the second thing I did was work with the team I'd been working really closely with. So naive little me thought this was going to be easy. I thought, oh, we're all good friends. We've been working on this and crying on each other's shoulders for 3 months. I just need to tap them on the shoulder when the time is right, and they'll do it for me. But no, that did not happen. They were still working in this kind of fiery crisis of hell where consultancies were throwing requirements at them left, right and centre. And someone asking them to take something out of the service wasn't really high on their priority list. And as has already been talked about, accessibility is not always high on the list either. So I needed to find allies within that team that I knew that they believed in accessibility as much as I did. And I asked them to kind of be my ninjas, basically, because I was no longer in, you know, a lot of the meetings, and they helped make the case on my behalf. There was quite a lot of nagging over Slack as well, don't get me wrong. And it worked, hurrah. So this was me announcing on Slack that we made the first change. The PDS team did their work first, well done them. And this was announcing the second change on Twitter once the vaccination booking service had done the dev work to take the screen out. So all in all, the question was live in the service for about 9 or 10 weeks, which at the time felt like an age, but in the grand scheme of how long the pandemic actually rolled on for, it was a drop in the ocean. And the service has now been repurposed for flu vaccinations and everything like that. So I was pretty proud that we got to where we got to so quickly. And the message I like to leave people with when I do this talk is that change to infrastructure services benefit many. So you can make front-end services accessible, that's great, let's keep doing that. But if you're making infrastructure services, databases, clunky old cranks under the surface, if you're making them inclusive and accessible, it's going to have lots more knock-on effects and ripple effects. So after I did this work, I had people from other areas of the NHS reaching out to me to say, oh, can we use the API now too? Like, what did you do? Can you share with us? The testing service had already kind of redesigned their version of this about 7 times and were not getting good press. So we were working with them. And had other people from other government departments reaching out to learn from what we did. The Apply for a National Insurance number team were in a pretty sticky situation. They didn't even have unspecified or unknown to work with, so I'm not sure where they got to. But yeah, so like I've said, I think we're getting much better at designing inclusive front-end services. I think there's still lots of work we can do, and the other two talks in this track are demonstrating some of how we can do that. There's always more best practice we can push, but over the last few years, I think there's been real progress in this space. Where I think we need to make much more progress is mounting the case for changing these outdated infrastructure systems. And the way we need to do this is if you're in large organisations, government departments, healthcare bodies, big beasts that have these systems, they're expensive and hard to change, and people say no. There will be multiple services connecting into them. So you need to get together to make the case together. Because if you change that one thing under here, you might make 10 or 20 services better. And if we don't do that, we'll be forever papering over the cracks. So thank you very much for listening. You can get in touch with me on LinkedIn. I have left the dark hole that is Twitter. I still exist, people still follow me, but I say nothing because it's sad there now. But I'm on LinkedIn if you want to find me, and my website, designforjoy.co.uk, has my email address. I'm always happy to talk about designing for people of any sex or gender. I'm really passionate about it. And come find me afterwards. Thank you very much.
Monthly reporting making you want to shove sharp things up your nose? Try Dragon Metrics, the all-in-one SEO software with mind-blowing reporting tools.